Hey everyone, thanks for joining. I think we can get started. Um, Thank you everyone for joining for today's talk. Before we begin, I just want to invite everyone to turn your cameras on if you're able. It'd be great to see your faces and it'd be great to just spend the hour together. Love seeing anyone who's able to turn your cameras on, please do. My name is Leah, and I'm the event coordinator at Bay Nature Magazine. Many of you know Bay Nature as a quarterly print publication based in Berkeley that focuses on nature and conservation topics local to the Bay Area. We also have a website where we publish website-only content that also covers the same style of topics. But in the last 6 or 7 months, we've been really working on building up our events program as well. And these events are including virtual programs like this, as well as in-person hikes and outings that are all derived from the topics and experts and content that's featured in our magazine and on our website. So this is a great example of one of those kinds of events. It was based on a piece published all about Tahoe invasive species, and we're really lucky to be joined today by Brandon, who was featured in that piece, written by Sonia. So thank you all for joining. Yeah, please turn your cameras on if you're able. And also, if you have any questions during this conversation, please just type those into the chat, and we will get to as many as possible at the end. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Brandon Berry. Brandon is a staff research associate with the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, which collaborates with other universities, state and federal resource agencies to understand population dynamics and ecology of introduced species. His primary role includes conducting environmental research at Lake Tahoe and globally, and his research areas include water quality, aquatic ecology, invasive species, remote sensing, atmospheric science, and engineering. So thank you so much, Brandon, for joining us today, and thank you all of you for tuning in. I will turn it over to Brandon to share. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leah. Yes, I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, let's get that rolling. All right, hopefully everyone can see that okay.
Looks good.
Perfect. All right, yeah, so thank you everyone for joining today and hopefully learning a little something about Lake Tahoe and aquatic invasive species. As Leah mentioned, my name's Brandon, and this is kind of off of a piece that was done. I think it was the winter 2025 print edition of the magazine. So we're following up on that now with the virtual presentation. I'll go ahead and start with, this picture in the background here is a good example of what we're trying to protect at Lake Tahoe. I don't need to start it out with any gross pictures of invasive species or anything like that. We'll have plenty of those in the presentation, but I think it's nice to start things out with how beautiful the lake is and what we are trying to protect here. So without further ado, we'll get going. All right, so I work for the Tahoe Environmental Research Center. This is a satellite research unit of UC Davis. We engage in environmental research, both aquatic and terrestrial. And our focus is obviously on the Tahoe area, but we do research globally and have projects all around the world. The research began up in Tahoe around 1958 and has come quite a long way since then. In 2005, the Tahoe Environmental Research Center was kind of born from the group that predecessed it at UC Davis and is now what it has become today. For anyone who's not familiar with Turk, is what we call it. We do publish a state of the lake report for Lake Tahoe. This kind of focuses on a lot of our ongoing monitoring efforts and scientific research at the lake. So anyone who's actually interested in what's going on an annual basis at Lake Tahoe, this is a great resource for that in particular. If you go to our website, you can access state of the lake reports and any events that we have going on. And I would encourage you guys, for those not familiar with Turk's mission, to go check out the website and see what we're up to, because there's a lot of cool research going on outside of what we're talking about today. And like I said, around the world as well. So, um, but today we're going to focus on Tahoe. I think Leah did a good job introducing me, so I'll keep this short. But I'm a staff research associate with Turk. I will preface this presentation with saying I am not a subject matter expert in invasive species. I do a lot of invasive species work in my position. I do a lot of, basically my role is a lot of the field operations that go on in our group. So think anything science-based that needs to get completed out in the field, that's generally what I'm involved in. This is, any sort of projects involving the research vessels or monitoring projects going off of that. A lot of invasive species work, but dive operations, remote sensing, a lot of different pieces kind of go into this job, and those projects are range, from water quality to atmospheric sciences, ecology, engineering. Do a lot of stream flow work. Invasive species is one of these, along with a lot of other things. So definitely just kind of the tip of the iceberg today on what I do, but invasive species is an important part of Lake Tahoe and the research that we do up there. Before we dive into the Tahoe invasive species world, I think it's important to just go over a few definitions. Um, And a lot of these, well, the first one's going to be intuitive for a lot of you guys. A native species. Everyone, I think, probably has a pretty good idea of what a native species is. Originated in the area and has adapted to that area essentially. So that with that, we go into non-native, a species that originated somewhere else and has been introduced to an area or an environment. And then inside of that, we have invasive species. So this is a non-native species that causes harm to the environment, and that's the distinction there. Um, Non-native and invasive get, I think, used interchangeably a lot, and I think sometimes that's okay, but maybe sometimes it's not the same. It's kind of like the old, all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares sort of method there. So just pieces to keep in mind today as we go through the presentation. Um, in particular, today, we're going to be talking about aquatic invasive species. There are plenty of other types, terrestrial invasive species in Lake Tahoe, but aquatic is what I tend to focus on with a lot of my work, and that is what Tahoe has done kind of a really good job on setting the bar on managing aquatic invasive species. Um, these aquatic invasive species have, or AIS for short, so if you see AIS, that's kind of what we're referring to, negative impacts on native ecosystems. They have negative impacts on recreation. Think boating, think paddling, fishing, even just going to the beach. Can these aquatic invasive species can have negative impacts on that. Water quality, bad impacts on water quality for sure. And they can even reach into the surrounding communities of the lake. And with that, local businesses around the area for sure are affected by these invasive species. So they have a big effect on everything Lake Tahoe, essentially. All right, why Lake Tahoe? Why do we have this problem here? Tahoe is known as the jewel of the Sierra. I'm sure many of you have spent 1 or 2 days at Lake Tahoe and know how great and special a place it is. The population there has increased significantly in the last, 60 years or so, I'd say. Um, and specifically tourism, in the recent history has gone up significantly. I think we're at around 15 million visitors per year, somewhere around there. Everyone Whether they're at the beach, whether they're boating, paddling, fishing, a lot of them are engaging with the lake in some form or another. That picture there is Sand Harbor on just a normal day. And honestly, now that looks like a less crowded day at Sand Harbor. Most days in summer at Sand Harbor now, there's a line to get into the park, starting at 6 a.m. And then by midday, it's shoulder to shoulder on the beach. And that's just one beach on Lake Tahoe. There's plenty of other beaches that experience the same thing. So you could imagine that with that many people coming into the basin and recreating at the lake, there's a lot of vectors for aquatic invasive species. We can start out with what the lake looked like before any of these guys came in. So this is a historic circa late 1880s food web of Lake Tahoe. You have a lot of this is the native ecosystem. So you have the Lahontan cutthroat trout. It's a big offshore fish that was in the lake. And then you have other nearshore and bottom fish. You have plants. You have planktonic species and benthic macroinvertebrates. So we don't need to go into details on any of these, but just you can kind of get an idea of it wasn't that complicated of a system. It was pretty straightforward with the food web and where things interacted, which all was changed by invasive species. So aquatic invasive species at Lake Tahoe. Um, this graphic here, if you can see that, is kind of the follow-up to that last historic food web. This is the timeline of the introduction of invasive species, essentially. A lot of invasive species, not all of them, but some of the big ones. And you have a lot of the trout earlier, right around 1900, followed by, things like crayfish, the salmon, mysis shrimp, and then closer to 2000, you see things start getting a little crazier with more introductions and a lot going on in the last, let's say, 25 to 30 years. Um, these introductions of invasive species at Lake Tahoe are both intentional and unintentional. It can be the introduction of something, like a non-native fish, or invertebrates and plant species. These are all aquatic species, so they all fall under this AIS banner. And yeah, it's some were very much on purpose and some were very much not on purpose. So we're kind of gonna go through a few of these species just to get kind of a deeper understanding of background on how some of the main ones came to be in Lake Tahoe, and play a little game called intentional versus unintentional. So you can just yell it at yourself or yell it at the house or whatever you want to do, or just think it to yourself. But we'll go through a few of these, and and you guys can kind of guess on whether they were intentional or unintentional, starting with game fish. So these are all your trout species. Lake trout are a big guy in Tahoe. We have the salmon, the kokanee in there, along with the others. As far as impacts go, they do outcompete native species. So when we talked about that native Lahontan cutthroat trout, think about that guy as who they're outcompeting. And they also prey on native species. So some of the smaller fish, and even smaller Lahontan cutthroat trout, they'll eat those guys. So as far as intentional versus unintentional goes, you can guess now, but yes, a lot of this was intentional. These were intentional introductions for game fish, for fishing in Lake Tahoe. A lot of the fishery is now geared towards these fish, lake trout in particular, and salmon. And so if you've ever fished in Tahoe, you've probably caught one of these. I'm guessing you're probably not catching native fish too often if you're fishing in Tahoe, but yeah, the game fish were introduced on purpose. Next up is warm water fish. So these are going to be uh, your your goldfish there in the picture. That is a goldfish that was pulled out of Lake Tahoe, believe it or not. Then you have things like bluegill, catfish, large and smallmouth bass. These guys are generally in the southern part of the lake, the Keys in particular. They impact wise, similar, they outcompete native species. Um, and then these guys, this gets a little bit more into altering prey dynamics and habitat alteration. These guys, when you think of the Tahoe Keys, that's not what you think of habitat wise, like traditional Lake Tahoe, native Lake Tahoe, let's say. And so these guys tend to thrive in those altered habitats. Um, Marinas too. A lot of marinas, you'll find some of these fish in there. So that's where you're going to find these. Intentional versus unintentional, mostly unintentional. I say that these were not introduced on purpose. I think there's a line here on unintentional, and that being that many of these were likely introduced from someone dumping their aquarium in the lake. Something as simple as that. That is something where I think it's called unintentional. I don't know too many people that just wander around the shores of Lake Tahoe carrying their aquariums and then trip over something and accidentally dump it into the lake. So I think there is intentionality with that, but that is on the lines of, illegal intentionality, dropping things like this into the lake. Also, along those lines are fishermen, maybe, who want to go fish for bass or something like that. Maybe a little introduction through that way. There are a lot of different vectors, but in general, we call this an unintentional introduction into the lake. Aquatic plants are one that do get a lot of press, which is a good thing because they have huge impacts on the lake. We have Eurasian water milfoil and curly leaf pondweed at Lake Tahoe. Again, this is primarily found in the southern part of the lake and in areas like the Keys or marinas. These guys, similar to the other ones, there's a trend here, outcompete native plants. And what these guys do is they actually increase sediment levels. So they kind of create this feedback loop of trapping sediment in the areas that they're growing and creating this sort of muddy substrate around them, which then promotes their growth, but also creates unsuitable habitat for native plants and fish, really, as well. So the more of these invasive plants you get, and the more growth they have, the more you get this habitat kind of destruction and this what we'll call a positive feedback loop in a negative way on the plants just kind of proliferating throughout Tahoe. Intentional versus unintentional, definitely unintentional. Things like this are potentially, watercraft is a vector. There's other vectors as well. Even sometimes waterfowl like can transport things like this. Um, but these were definitely not intentionally introduced into the lake. Next up, mysis shrimp. I don't know if anyone's familiar with mysis shrimp. We do have shrimp species in Lake Tahoe. They are a smaller shrimp, biggest these guys are going to get is around an inch. So they are tiny. But we do have this freshwater shrimp species. They prey on native zooplankton. So Daphnia are a native zooplankton in the lake, and these shrimp eat Daphnia. So that caused Daphnia zooplankton crash after the shrimp were introduced. And the Daphnia actually are very good grazers. They kind of just shovel particles into their mouths indiscriminately. So they're kind of like little Roombas for Lake Tahoe. And when you think that their population crashes, all of a sudden, all these particles are not being consumed. So they actually have an impact on lake clarity. And in turn, this introduction of mysis shrimp has a negative impact on lake clarity because they're eating these Daphnia, which tend to clear the waters of Tahoe. So an interesting ecological kind of chain of events there with these guys. Um, Definitely invasive and intentional versus unintentional. Intentional. Yeah, these guys were introduced as a food source for the game fish. So they were introduced to plump up those trout species. So you'd have nice, big, fat, juicy trout to catch in Lake Tahoe. Didn't exactly work out that way. That's a conversation for a different time. Turk has done a lot of research on the mysis shrimp and their ecological impacts. So if you're intrigued by that, we'll touch on the project a little bit later in the presentation, but there's a lot more information on our website. Kind of a cool project. Asian clams are a big one at Lake Tahoe. Um, these guys negatively impact native inverts. And one of the main things we're kind of discovering with these clams is they have heavy algae growth associated with them. So what they're doing is areas with dense populations of these clams filter water out of the water column. And in doing so, they then excrete a bunch of nutrients kind of right at that sediment layer there. So you're just piling up a bunch of nutrients at the bottom of the lake. And that then in turn causes algae blooms. So there's these big algae blooms that we see, and they tend to be over areas of really high densities of clams, which is pretty interesting. Again, another project that we have worked on a lot. The Asian clams are something that we are very familiar with at Turk, and we will touch on that again later. But as far as now, intentional versus unintentional, these were unintentional. Likely through watercraft, I would say, was the main vector for these clams. Their veliger state is their juvenile state is essentially microscopic. So a ballast tank or something like that was transported from one lake to another could have had thousands of little tiny baby clams in there, and then you dump that in Lake Tahoe, and all of a sudden we have a clam population now. Um, Unknown that is exactly the route that was taken for them to get here, but definitely unintentional. Anyone who's been up on the news, and I think the article touched on New Zealand mud snails as well. This is our latest AIS at Lake Tahoe, our latest visitor. They were found in Lake Tahoe in 2023. Um, Unknown introduction source. So unknown how they got in. They are tiny, these New Zealand mud snails. They're about the size of a grain of rice, and they can reproduce asexually. So they colonize new waters really quick. And if you think about trying to eradicate something like a grain of rice that can just clone itself, um, not easy to do. So I think these guys are here to stay. It's all very new, and there are efforts being put into how best to mitigate and control New Zealand mud snails now. Um, that map there is the preliminary uh, kind of monitoring effort put into where they are. Again, South Lake. There's a trend in the South Lake Tahoe, an invasive species world for sure. These guys were unintentional, definitely unintentional. They could have easily just been one of them on some waders or attached to something. Who knows? A grain of rice is hard to keep out sometimes. And then continued threats. You guys, anyone in the Bay Area has probably seen lately the news of the golden mussels. That's kind of been a hot topic in the Delta, at least. This is the latest species of mussels to come into California waterways, and there will likely be, there already are effects on, if any of you guys have boats or are using boats on different lakes, probably going to have some inspection regulations going into effect here, uh, probably because of this golden mussel. And a lot of those inspections and the regulations are actually based off of Lake Tahoe's program. So we can kind of get to that right now and what is being done at Lake Tahoe to stop AIS and stop the introduction of the spread of invasive species at the lake. Lake Tahoe is one of the most protected water bodies in the US. There are millions of dollars spent every year combating AIS and trying to keep the ones in the lake at bay, but more intentionally trying to keep everything else out of the lake. And there are a bunch of different programs that we'll get into on this. Tahoe is really a leader in combating aquatic invasive species and managing them at the lake. We do have them present in Lake Tahoe. It's no secret that they exist here, but there is a lot of effort put into limiting their effects on the lake, and like we've talked about, keeping them out as well. So there's just a ton of organizations that are dedicated or have groups dedicated to AIS at Lake Tahoe, which is great that we have all this support for this program. Combating AIS generally can break it down into four main areas: prevention, education, control, and monitoring. So we're going to go through those real quick. This is kind of a text-heavy slide, but prevention is the first line of defense and honestly the most important, because if they don't get into the lake, then you don't have to deal with them. And once they're in, they're probably staying in. What do we do at Tahoe? This is kind of what we're talking about with the watercraft inspections. Every watercraft that is coming into the basin and onto the lake gets inspected for invasive species, which is a huge effort. And the watercraft inspection program, details over on the right over there. Watercraft are a leading vector for AIS. This was implemented in 2008. So after some of those, I think the clams came in around 2000. This is a little bit of a response maybe to that and to threats in other areas where it was, time to make a push to keep things out of Lake Tahoe. Every motorized boat is inspected. And then each year there's hundreds of potential species and invaders that are stopped with these inspections. So the program does work. It's a lot of effort that goes into it, but it is very efficient in what it does. And it really is the gold standard for the nation. So when we talk about other areas implementing programs, they tend to come to Tahoe and this program and try to take notes from what we've done up here. Other prevention sources are Tahoe Keepers, is a you can look that up. It's a kind of same thing, preventing spread of invasive species, and then other outreach campaigns. Education is kind of that same world with the outreach, public campaigns and events, programs to just spread the word on keeping invasive species out of the basin, out of Tahoe. Control is an important one. This is once they're already in the lake, it's just managing them. And when we say managing and control, what does that mean? Yeah, removing, killing. Control measures can take various different forms. Bottom barriers tend to be a very effective form against plants and clams too. You're essentially suffocating them. Hand pulling is also a very effective yet more labor intensive kind of method. And then there are always new innovative solutions coming in. That picture down on the bottom there with the boat is a boat in one of the marinas in South in South Lake, and they have a bunch of UV lights strapped to the bottom of the boat. So they drive around that area there, blasting the plants, the invasive plants in the marina there with UV light to try to cut back and kill off as much of the invasive plants as they can. So, never a shortage of new ideas, which is great. The monitoring piece is something that we do a lot of at Turk. This is both for existing species that we know are in the lake already and keeping eyes out for new species. There are standardized techniques that we use, visual surveys. The boat inspections are a good example of monitoring. We're monitoring the boats for any species on there. Visual surveys tend to be more diver related. And then there are also new innovative monitoring techniques. eDNA is a big one nowadays. That's kind of coming to the forefront. That's being a little more widely accepted. And this is a huge kind of leap forward in AIS monitoring. So you're actually just monitoring for the DNA of that species in a body of water, which is really cool. Doesn't have to be water. For us, it is. And then remote sensing techniques. Never a shortage of new technology coming out to try to keep tabs on everything with remote sensing, whether that be with autonomous vehicles, satellite imagery, drones, sonar, tons of different options there as well. Okay, Turk projects, we talked a little bit about the education. These are the ones that we're focused on. So education, I mentioned, we have outreach and programs. We have a citizen science app, which is great. There'll be a link to that later. That's a cool way for people who are at the lake to get involved and see, if you see something that you think is weird or you'd like to report it, that's a great resource for people. We can't be everywhere on the lake, so that is a huge asset to us is going through that data and saying, whoa, yeah, that's something that we haven't seen. So that's really cool. The control pieces, we are always developing new control techniques, and we do get involved with a lot of the early detection and rapid response for invasives at the lake. We have 2 research vessels on the water 365 days a year. So we are kind of the first responders to anything that happens out on Lake Tahoe, which is great. Having that access to be out on the water, checking something new out anytime when we need to be. And then monitoring is something we do a lot of as well. And this we kind of touched on. We are always looking at new monitoring strategies and innovating new techniques. So yeah, autonomous vehicles, eDNA, those are 2 new worlds that we do a lot of research in and hold a lot of promise in the invasive species world. Okay, Asian clams, we touched on them earlier. Corbicula, that's their scientific name, but we're going to talk a little bit about what we do with them just so you guys get an idea on what I'm talking about when I say monitoring and controlling and all these things. They're fancy words. What does that mean? Um, we had a big project at Sand Harbor State Park. There are Asian clams there. There is a satellite population there that kind of started right at the boat ramp. So as you could guess, watercraft likely a vector for that once again. And we were working on doing 3 years of monitoring the population after they implemented bottom barrier treatment there. So what they did is they came in, laid a bunch of bottom barriers down. That suffocates the clams and kills them. And then we monitored those populations for the next 3 years to see how the population bounced back, was it effective? All these sorts of things. The connection to the algae that I was talking about earlier is also a piece of this. and you can see a little bit in that picture there, some clams with some algae going on. We'll look more into that later. But these surveys are all dive surveys. So it's a bunch of divers down there, and we have a video that we'll check out and start in a second. I'll try to let you guys just watch the video and not talk through it. But this gives you an idea of what the divers are doing down there on their transect lines. We divide the Sand Harbor State Park into a bunch of different areas. We lay out a bunch of transect lines, and then the divers come through on these transect lines and are going to be essentially taking little samples for clams. They're going to do a scoop there, and you're going to see them sift out all the sand and then count the actual clams that are present in that scoop, and then move on to the next scoop. And that gives us our transect data, which we can then use to evaluate and map the clam populations at Sand Harbor. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and play the video. Will also notice in this video all that green algae floating around. That is this metaphyton algae we're talking about that is linked to the clam populations. And you'll see how easily it kind of just moves with water currents and how hard it is to keep tabs on things like that as well. So here you go. Without further ado, I'll just try not to talk and let you listen to some divers breathing underwater. You can see they're just, all they are is minnow traps. Those are minnow traps, essentially a fine mesh sieve, and they're shaking all the sand out. They have their clipboards there, and they're taking some headings on their transect and just take it to the next site. They take samples about every 5 meters or so. And we do this throughout the entire survey area. So this is a better view up close. Nice. That gives a decent idea of what we're doing out there on some of these monitoring. I think it's easy to throw around these terms and say divers, and what does that mean when you just look at stuff? Clams live in the sand, so you actually need to scoop out clams and check them that way. Little pieces that are just, kind of lost in translation through text and verbiage. There you go. It's a good example of all the algae getting picked up there at the end. That algae that we talk about being associated with the clams is what you're going to see ending up on shore. It's moved very easily by water currents. So you think wave action comes in and can pile all that algae up on shore, which is not exactly what you think of when you think of Lake Tahoe, a beach covered in algae. Again, this is one of our bigger invasive species projects that we're working on. So we do have more information on that. If you guys want to find out more, feel free to reach out to me directly or check out the website. There is a map associated with this work as well, which is cool to go check out. I think we'll just skip that today, but you can play around with it if you want to take a peek at, the Sand Harbor project and how we represent the data. You get an idea there using a heat map of where the densest populations of clams are. So that yellow area, the red areas, those are going to be your really high population densities of clams in a place like that. It's a nice way of visualizing the data and presenting it to agencies and management individuals who make decisions on how to proceed with invasive species in the lake. We kind of talked about everything with the clams there, so the connection to algae, and the project lasting over 3 years. Shrimply Blue. This is the Mysis project. So this, again, Mysis shrimp, we talked about them earlier. You look at their mission statement: on a mission to restore Lake Tahoe's water clarity. That's supposed to say one dog treat at a time, I think. I probably deleted something there, but that sounds crazy. What do dog treats have to do with clarity at Lake Tahoe? So we talked about how the shrimp have an effect on clarity because they eat the native zooplankton who do a good job of cleaning the lake. Well, there was a pilot project initiated to harvest the shrimp, reduce the shrimp populations, which would then cause a bounce back, a recovery in the zooplankton populations, thus hopefully resulting in clearer water. There was a cool partnership that we had with the business group down in Davis at UCD, and they took this excess harvested shrimp, mysis shrimp, and we're turning it into dog treats. So then, think it's a really rich omega-3 treat. Dogs seem to love them. And so this was marketed as dog treats to kind of then help fund the research and the ongoing conservation efforts at Lake Tahoe, which was really cool. I'm just touching the tip of that one as well. And there's more information you can check out. I think Shrimply Blue has their own website, but a cool idea for kind of combating invasive species and conservation sustainably. All right, moving forward, what does the future hold for Lake Tahoe and AIS? Are new invasive species introductions going to happen? Yeah, probably so. We can spend a lot of time and effort to try to keep things out, which is great because we are doing a great job in that, but inevitably things are going to slip through the cracks. The New Zealand mud snails are a good example of that. Hopefully we keep out all the big stuff, the really bad stuff. That's the goal. And the other hard piece is once these guys are in for a lot of these species, eradicating them is unlikely. We can focus on mitigation techniques and living with them, but getting rid of them altogether is extremely difficult. So what does this mean? Does this mean Tahoe is just going to look like a lily pond with lionfish swimming around, 50 years from now? No, it's not. It does not mean that. Tahoe provides a natural buffer based on a lot of its environmental factors. It's a high alpine freshwater oligotrophic lake. It's cold up there, so you've just gotten rid of a ton of species. You could throw a lionfish in there right now and it would not survive, which is great. We have a natural buffer against a lot of invasives at Tahoe, which is really good. So hopefully that helps us. And then combined with human innovation and ingenuity, there's always new solutions to these problems. So I think that's holds a lot of promise for combating these issues in the future. What can you guys do if you are interested in learning more? Be a responsible human. Don't go dumping your fish tank in the lake. But smaller things like making sure if you're kayaking, your kayak is clean, drained, and dry. Inspect it. Like look at your equipment that you're taking out there. Make sure there's nothing attached. That's where that Tahoe Keepers program comes in. The citizen science applications are right there as well. Eyes on the Lake, citizensciencetahoe.org. We can share these links. I can share the presentation if we'd like to. But those are great ways to actually make a difference if you are up at the lake and have eyes on the lake, so to speak. Yeah, with that, I'll leave you with the little cartoon that I like of Tahoe's original invasive species or aquatic invasive species, which I think is pretty self-explanatory from that there. But I think now we can open it up for questions if there's time. Yeah, we got plenty of time, right?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Brandon, for this presentation. It was super informative and just yeah, thank you for sharing your work.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do have some questions in the chat, and those of you listening, if you have any more questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat, and we'll get to as many as possible. We're gonna transition now to the Q&A section. So what I'll do is I'm gonna call on those of you who have entered questions and invite you to unmute and ask your questions. Or if you'd prefer, I'm happy to also read your questions out loud. So I'll just start from the top, and you should be able to unmute yourself at this point. The first question I saw was from Russ and Kirk. Russ and Kirk, do you guys mind unmuting and asking your question?
Yeah, there we go. I just wanted to ask how the um, boats are infected, how the invasive species are killed.
I got most of that. How the boats are inspected and how they kill the invasive species in those inspections.
Yes,
Yeah, good
right.
question. So anyone who's been to Tahoe, there are boat inspection stations, essentially all around the lake. So any main artery into the lake has an inspection station. So what you'll do is you'll tow your boat to the inspection station. They'll have people there who actually inspect your boat. What they're looking for is obviously anything attached to the boat, but also any water. What we talked about before with, the veligers, the juveniles of these species can be microscopic, so you're not going to see them. So that's why it's really important to have clean, drained, and dry is kind of their motto.
Okay.
If there is water, um, what they do is a decontamination process, and that is just pumping extremely hot water through any systems that might have water. And that hot water, there's a contact time that they'll run it through to kill any potential invasive species in there. So that is kind of the decon method for those boat inspection programs. Good question.
Thank you. Thanks.
Ah,
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking, Russ and Kirk. Our next question is from Vicky. Vicky, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Um, I was wondering if you could briefly explain eDNA.
yes. Yes. Very good question. And a hot topic, like I said, these days, it's still very new. So eDNA, the little e there just stands for environmental. So environmental DNA. So think anything we all shed hair, dust, or like cells all the time. Any species is doing that as well. And that there is DNA in those, shed cells essentially. So in a system like Tahoe, we can take water samples um, and then actually run analysis to see what DNA pops up in that water sample from species that have shed cells there. So you're only going to get positive hits on species that are present in the lake, or somehow that DNA has gotten into the lake. This is a really awesome tool for invasive species work. I know a lot of different programs that are using this now, but also really cool for other programs doing like, food web work. Like you can go look at scat from something and run eDNA on that and see what that animal has eaten for the last 3 months. A lot of cool projects involving eDNA coming out. But yeah, that little E just means environmental.
So, excuse me. So it could be used to analyze the diet of from bird scat.
100%. Yep.
Okay,
And pieces of, whatever that bird ate, DNA from there is going to pop up. So
yep.
you could figure that out from there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Vicky. Yeah, and I think By Nature published a piece about eDNA too, and I'm happy to send that as well. But a question from Carolyn. Carolyn, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
I was just wondering how the federal cuts are look like they're going to be affecting you or have already, and what does the future look like in that regard?
Well, unfortunately, that is a really good question right now. And Leah and I were actually just talking about that earlier today. I'm grateful that so far we personally at Turk haven't been, well, I shouldn't say that. Some of our projects have been affected by the federal cuts. None of the invasive species work we're currently doing is, but Leo was the one who told me actually that it just came out that I think it was the Forest Service Aquatic Invasive Species Program at Lake Tahoe did just cut positions in that group. So yes, the greater Tahoe aquatic invasive species world is suffering cuts from the federal decisions at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you, Carolyn. Question from Paul. Paul, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Brandon. This has been great. I was
Yeah.
curious about your slide about the 1880s food chain and wondering how we know about that. Were there actual surveys done at that time?
You know, that is a really good question that I don't know the exact details on how that was all created. We know the native species research on Lake Tahoe does go back farther than the Tahoe Research Center, essentially, that I was talking about when I said started in 1958. So yes, there is research that goes back much farther than that. That was just when our group was initiated up here. So that would be how a lot of that information was collected. And then as time has progressed and these new species have come in, we're able to map them and keep tabs with their introductions. A lot of the native species are still present in Lake Tahoe, with a few minor exceptions. The cutthroat trout being the big one. And then now the reintroduction of those guys coming back in is actually really cool to see. But yeah, long-winded way of saying, yes, there was research done before our time that was mapping food web dynamics in Tahoe.
Thanks, Paul, for your question. And next question is from Rick Landman. Rick, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Hey, Brandon, thanks for all you do. Can a large Lahontan cutthroat defend itself against a Mackinac lake trout? And have you thought about introducing some YY lake trout to genetic method to have them sort of wipe themselves out?
Yeah. First question. A full-grown Lahontan, I think, would be okay. I'm not a fisheries expert, but I have worked on some projects with fisheries. And from my understanding, full-grown Lahantans are going to be all right. The problem is that non-full-grown LCT, Lahontan cutthroats, they're getting gobbled up, exactly like you said. So when these reintroductions occur, a lot of the time, they're with the smaller juvenile Lahontan cutthroat trout, and then you dump them into the lake, and they end up just being a food source for the Mackinac, the lake trout. So very, very good observation there. As far as getting rid of lake trout, I don't know where everyone stands on that. I don't know any efforts. I'm not aware of any efforts to get rid of them currently. Doing something like genetic modification on them makes sense and managing them that way. I think the lake trout have become, I don't want to say a cornerstone, that's not the right word, but a big part of the Tahoe dynamic now with the fishery as well. So, from an environmental standpoint, going back to what it was before their introduction, yes. But you're going to have a lot of different stakeholders who may feel differently on that in the area. So good thoughts for sure.
Thanks for both of your questions, Rick. And then we have a question from Bay Nature, actually. And I think it's similar to Carolyn's question, but I'm wondering if whoever's here from Bay Nature wants to unmute and ask more.
Oh, I just had heard that two people who worked specifically on AIS projects were cut, and I was wondering how that would affect the work specifically against AIS, if you know yet. This is Kate.
I think it sounds like what you're referring to is what Leah and I were chatting about with the Forest Service Aquatic
Yeah.
Invasive Species Program? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know the details of that as of yet.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Cool. Thank you.
but I mean, any sort of reduction in people working on AIS, I would say has a negative impact on the AIS program at Lake Tahoe.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty safe to say.
Thank you. Good to see you, Kate. We have a question from Rudy, I think. Hey, Rudy. Rudy gave a talk a while ago actually about gull identification. Rudy had a question. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Hey, everyone. Hey, Leah. So yeah, I'm wondering if it's difficult to run projects across state lines because I deal with a similar situation between Fed and state government issues, and it can get interesting sometimes. And just to address your previous comment, it seems like any environmental organization was stretched thin before these cuts. And I just can't imagine how things are going to go now. And then you also implied that South Lake Tahoe seems to have a AIS entry issue. It seems to be a hot spot. And I'm assuming that that's just probably the most typical place that boats put in and people come to, et cetera. That's it.
Yeah. Let me start with the first one and remind me if I forget anything. The bi-state working. Yes. I guess I imagine that you have experience in this because it does present its challenges. I will say that we are pretty lucky at Tahoe. There is a lot of cooperation between California and Nevada regarding lakes issues. You do run into minor details on projects that are, California funded or Nevada funded, but the TRPA is a bi-state organization. So a lot of what they try to promote is really working together on all that. And I think they do a good job of that. So we're lucky in that sense that we have them. And I think a buy-in from both parties, essentially. The second thing was, remind me what part 2 of that was.
That was the, you seem to imply that South Lake Tahoe has an AIS entry issue.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely South Lake. The Keys, the Tahoe Keys are a hotbed for AIS. That whole area with plants, with a lot of those smaller warm water fish we talk about, that is kind of the root of all evil in some senses. They do get a lot of boat put-ins down there as well, so there is that piece of it for sure. But I would say that a lot of AIS issues stem from the Keys in particular. And then there was a third part, but I can't remember that one either.
I think there were just the two, actually.
Okay, cool.
But thank you for your question, Rudy. It's good to see you. And thank you, Brandon, for all of your answers.
Yeah.
I think that we can wrap up there as it is the top of the hour, but I just want to thank everyone for joining today and making time to share this talk. And biggest thank you goes to Brandon for sharing your expertise and sharing and making this presentation for us all. It was great, very informative, and just appreciate you sharing your time. So thank you so much. Those of you listening, sometimes I like just like everyone can unmute, and if I count down from 3, we can thank Brandon together. So I think you should be able to unmute. I'll count us down 3, 2, 1, and then we can say thank you. But here we go. Okay. 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. It was a joy chatting with you all, and feel free to reach out personally if you have any questions. I'm happy to discuss it further. So nice chatting with you guys.
Thank you. I'll be sending out the recording to everyone who registered, as well as some links that Brandon shared as well. So yeah, I'll be making more over email. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you guys.
Bye.
That's quite.